Hello and welcome to our live webcast, The Emergence of the Hybrid P2P Era. Thank you for joining us. My name is Tim Wilson and I'll be the operator for our presentation today. Now before we get underway, a few notes. I want to take a few moments to acquaint you with a few features of this web event technology. At any time, you may adjust your audio using any computer volume settings that you may have. Also, a feature that we encourage you to use is on the right side of your screen, the Q&A pod. You'll see that large text chat window. There's a large window which holds all of your sent messages and a smaller text box at the bottom where you can type in your questions. To send any question, click in that text box, type your text, and when finished, click the send button. All questions that you submit are only seen by today's presenters, and we'll address these verbally during the presentation. They'll be responded to in the order in which they were received. And with all of that said, it's my pleasure at this time to introduce our speaker, Jon W. Hansen, writer and speaker at Procurement Insights. As the editor and lead writer for the Procurement Insights blog, Jon Hansen has written nearly 3,000 articles and papers, as well as 5 books on subjects as diverse as the supply chain practice, public sector policy, emerging business trends, and social media. And it's my pleasure at this time to pass the microphone over to Jon Hansen. And Jon, welcome.
Well, thank you, Tim. And you know what? It's great to share. I guess we'd call these the virtual airwaves, right? Or virtual webinar waves?
Indeed, we do.
What would be the appropriate description?
It's virtual something.
Virtual something. There you go. Well, listen, everyone, it's great to join you today. And there's a few things I want to touch on before we get into the presentation, the focus of what we're going to have. And I call them the housekeeping chores or continued housekeeping chores. To start, I want to remind everybody that the Q&A section, I encourage you to use it. There's going to be polls. This is going to be very much an interactive experience. In other words, it's not going to be just me talking. And, of course, I'll be sharing some of that discussion with Tim. But we encourage you to ask questions throughout the entire session. And I find that this dialogue gives you an opportunity to help us to hone in specifically on areas that are most important to you. So I want to remind you to avail yourself of that as well. Now, Tim, I'm getting a couple of comments in here. Darlene Petrie and Ellen Allen are saying that they have no sound coming through.
Okay, and I would recommend refreshing your browser. That will typically resolve any issues that you may have. And the transmitted sound is good, and if you need assistance, you can call our technical support staff. That information is in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. Okay,
now, Donna and Andrea have said that they can't hear anything at all. And so we've got 4 or 5 people doing that. One person said they already did a refresh and nothing's coming through. So I'm not sure. I mean, it may not be a bad thing they can't hear me. You never know. But
I will address these listeners, behind the scenes while we continue with the presentation.
Perfect. Okay. Now, in terms of this, and let's talk about the comprehensive source-to-pay suite from Zygus. Again, looking in these particular areas, the one thing that I would say at this stage, because we want to get right into it, is after the webinar itself, you'll be taken to a Zygus page, and what you'll be able to do is click on there and get some great insights and great information in terms of Zygus as to their P2P offering, which will obviously extend our discussion in that regard, because we're talking about, after all, hybrid P2P systems. Get an understanding of how that organization responds to the changes that are happening in our industry around us. So I just want to encourage you to do that. I also want to remind you as I click forward, and I am clicking forward. Oh, there's that guy again. I don't know who that is, Tim. As I move forward, that we will have what's known as a tweet chat following this webinar, and it'll be for about a 24-hour period, and it'll start about 15, 20 minutes afterwards, and it is under the hashtag P2P Hybrid. Now, again, we'll be joined by other people who are in the industry, some industry thought leaders and experts, so we'll share some of our obviously the poll results that we have. They'll share their insights and perspectives on what exactly a hybrid P2P evolution is all about. Now, in terms of specifically focusing on today, and there's a little bit of a delay in the click. There we go. We're going to focus on 3 areas today specifically. We're going to identify capacity and performance gap in your current procurement practice. Now, you may wonder, what does this have to do with hybrid P2P? And, Tim, when you think of hybrid P2P, you automatically think of technology, I would imagine. I don't want to speak for you, but doesn't that come to your mind immediately?
It does, yes.
And in reality, that's logical. However, the technology is really an extension of both our individual practices on the day-to-day basis as well as our organizational structure. And so we're going to go through a logical progression here, and starting with what are the performance gaps in the current procurement practice. We're going to then move into what is the current procurement practices within your organization and how it uses those practices or models to achieve their end results. And then finally, we'll touch on how to address these gaps through a true hybrid P2P model approach. That sounds pretty interesting, doesn't it, Tim?
It sure does.
All right, and starting right out of the gate, we're going to give you a poll question. We're going to get you involved. It's going to be based on, you say purchasing. You know the old saying, you say tomato, I say tomato, let's call the whole thing off. Purchasing and procurement, what are the differences? We have, and even sourcing is an issue that somebody says, is it different from purchasing? Is it different from procurement? Well, in this first poll, I'm going to ask you the question of this, very simply. Which word best describes your present role within your organization? Are you purchasing? Are you procurement? Are you sourcing? Not sure, or you just don't want to vote, although I would encourage you to vote. I think we got about a minute for them to do that, right, Tim?
Well, we'll just wait till activity dies down, and then we'll share the results. Again, an invitation to our audience to submit a question at any time by typing it into the Q&A pod on the right side of your screen.
Okay. And for all of you who are writing, a couple more people have written that they have no sound, and they've tried with no luck. And I think we're working on those technical areas as well as directing them, right, Tim?
Correct. Most of that has been resolved. And
good.
Okay.
Good. Now,
why don't we go ahead and share the results so it looks like everybody who's going to vote has. And over half the audience says they're involved in procurement.
Okay, so procurement. Okay, now I'm going to pose this question to the audience. Why did you say procurement? For those who responded procurement, why did you say procurement? We'll give you a minute or two to respond to that. And also purchasing and sourcing. Why did you come up with those particular answers? We'll give them a few minutes to do that because you want to know something very interesting, is that some of Tim talked about procurement and purchasing as being a matter of semantics, that there's a difference. Now, others have talked about sourcing or strategic sourcing, that extends into risk management and other areas of operation. And yet many of the reports combine them together, as we'll see momentarily, saying that, well, really, for the sake of this discussion or any kind of discussion, that they're all one and the same. What do you think? Do you think that there's a difference? I mean, I know you're not from purchasing background, Tim, but when you hear the word purchasing procurement, does it mean anything different to you?
Not to me personally, but seeing how they are titled differently, I have to believe that there is a difference.
Well, you know what? Marie says procurement incorporates all the options offered. That's an interesting thing. Procurement, Marjorie adds that procurement describes all services, sourcing, and let me just see this. Click on this to bring it expanded a little bit. Purchasing and systems that support those practices. So is it safe to say that people feel that procurement is the elevation of purchasing, that purchasing is more transactional and buying, and procurement is really more expansive? The ones who said sourcing, how is that different? How do you feel that that is different? I'm asking this and taking the time to ask these questions simply because it leads into our next discussion in terms of the model of your organization, in terms of how it sets up the practice, and ultimately leads into how you utilize technology. Because technology, again, is critical, has a support mechanism, has an extension of your capabilities, but where are your capabilities focused? Is it designed in the organization itself? Do they say purchasing only does this, procurement does this? Within individual organizations, is there differentiation? I think that's an interesting question in terms of that. Another person, Donna, said it isolates the role when you say sourcing. So it's specific. So we've got different people here who have different job definitions and even different descriptions as to what each one of those means. So how do we correlate this, Tim, to bring it into sort of like a conducive or what you can call a collective relevance if people are having so many different backgrounds, purchasing, procurement, and sourcing? I mean, how do we bring it together, Tim? What do you think?
That's to be honest with you, I was addressing some of the attendees with their audio issues, and I missed that, but it's a good question. I don't know.
See, you know what? That's why it's always important to listen in class, right? I'm kidding.
I
know you're... You will be tested. By the way, everyone will be tested on this at the end of the webinar, so I just want to make everyone aware of that. What's interesting as we go to the next level, and I think this is the key part relative to the point of discussion here, is that when you look at procurement, when you look at purchasing, and I'm referring to an article that I'd recommend, I provided the link here, called 5 Models for Procurement Organizations. Some of them use the words procurement and purchasing interchangeably. And others use it to mean something quite different. And this is very interesting. And you know, when you look at this and the varied interpretations, for all intents and purposes, it could be a fair statement to say that there is no real difference, that it is merely a description. And it is merely, somebody who does purchasing does procurement, someone who does procurement does purchasing. Now, this is an important point because I want to make sure that, again, we're all starting from the same point, that we're all the same in terms of what we do. Span Matters talked about centralized, decentralized, or hybrid sourcing structure. They talked about the fact that sourcing is a new term that is growing in popularity, and it encompasses everything from purchasing to procurement, but it extends out to risk, supplier management, sustainability. And I want to offer this, and this is an important note to make. Regardless of whether you're in purchasing or you're a purchaser, regardless of whether you're procurement, regardless of whether you're sourcing, the one common factor that you have to recognize in today's world is that you have to extend the scope of your work and your efforts and expertise to include everything: risk, supplier management, and sustainability. And that is such a key factor. In a previous webinar, we talked about branding procurement. And one of the key areas is understanding where you can deliver the most strategic value, the most practical value to your organization. So we don't want to get too hung up on the term purchasing, procurement, and sourcing, because ultimately at the end of the day, and you know that old saying, Tim, all roads lead to Rome. Well, all roads lead to a defined functionality that may not necessarily be encapsulated in a single title, but ultimately in a single focus. Does that make sense, Tim?
It does, indeed.
And I think that's the key point. Now, when I ask this, and again, I'm going to pause to ask all of you, what do you make of that? I mean, here we have two sources of information, Span Matters and another organization, talking about the fact is that procurement and purchasing are interchangeable. Another one saying for intents and purposes, when you incorporate sourcing, even though it may reflect an extended functionality and responsibility, it's really, for the sake and purposes, all going to be the same. Do you agree with that? What do you think? Do you think that makes sense? I want to hear feedback, or at least read feedback. I know I can't hear feedback, but I want to be able to read feedback in terms of what your thoughts are, because that is an important foundation that we want to lay in this first section, is understanding the fact that when we look at the description of our titles, that it really isn't a matter of purchasing, it isn't a matter of procurement, it isn't a matter of sourcing, it's a matter of outcome. And this leads, of course, being able to leverage P2P technology and a hybrid P2P platform. Now, let me see some comments here. Isolates the role when you say sourcing. Interesting. Most comprehensive word of them. Donna, she was talking about that. When you say, Donna, if you could clarify a little bit more, when you say most comprehensive word of them, are you saying that sourcing is the most comprehensive word, or are you saying that it's something completely different terminology needs? Nope, you're not saying that. All right. So let's look at this, and I want to move to the next slide. Things are moving a little bit slow for me on the screen here, Tim, so if I have these pauses that seem like an hour, I know they're only a few seconds, forgive me for this. Referring back to that 5 models, and again, I'd encourage you to read the material that's provided with this in the link, because it provides you with a great insight of additional information that we can't cover here. The most important aim is to ensure that responsibilities for procurement are vested in the right people within the organization. Who takes ownership for that? When we talk about procurement, when we talk about our roles, who takes ownership for the things that need to be done and need to be accomplished going forward? And then, of course, when we look at this, and I'm using these as a reference point, despite these differences, as I said, purchasing, sourcing, and procurement are used interchangeably. You're talking about the sake of the article, but very much so in a hybrid P2P structure. So when you go in and Donna expand and think it gathers all roles, I think that's the way you have to approach it. Now, I don't know if you agree with that, but you have to put the titles aside and focus on this. Now, how many of you are familiar, and I don't know if, Tim, you've heard of a responsibility assignment matrix known as RACI matrix? No. Okay, so what it does is it breaks down when you look at your job of completing tasks and deliverables, and this is a way for you to know where you are in the hierarchy of your organization of responsibilities. There's those who do the work to achieve the task. There's those who delegate the work. There's the subject matter experts, and there are the updates and progress on task or the task completion. So everyone has a role. The real interesting point here is do you view these four as four different roles within your organization, or do you view them as multiple roles that can be handled by one or two people? That's the key point. Donna, when you said it gathers all roles, I think this is maybe what you're referring to. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with the RACI matrix or responsibility assignment matrix, as it's called. But if you're not, this is when you look at the role that you have. And it applies not just to the procurement world, but to all areas within an enterprise. But let's focus just on procurement here. Responsibility for completing the task, delegating, subject matter experts. I believe that to move into a hybrid P2P world, you have to incorporate and possess abilities in each of these areas. And if you look at your present alignment with work and what you're doing now within your organization, and the freedom you get within your organization to focus beyond narrowly confined areas. And I want to share a story with you, which I think is very important because organizational structure is key. Back in 2007, I realize it's 10 years ago. Back in 2007, CPO Agenda Roundtable had executives come together and talk about strategic procurement, talk about the fact, and I think I mentioned this previously in another webinar, where I said, they came back and they said one strategic thinker is worth 10 regular buyers, which I think inspired a certain amount of pushback, but nonetheless, we're still seeing that being relevant today. One of the CPOs who was there, executive, went over from a major corporation, I believe it was Nielsen or Cadbury Nielsen, to another organization. In his previous organization, he said, I was very much actively involved with the pre-acquisition discussions and the strategic sourcing and the supplier selection. I was involved in all of that. When I moved to this organization, it became an after function, whereas somebody else decided what we needed to do, and I was giving my marching orders. And it was very frustrating because I wasn't actively involved. I was limited to that first level of responsibility to achieve the task. I think what's important from a procurement standpoint, and not just with moving into this new hybrid P2P era, I think the important thing you have to look at yourself is how far down this matrix you go in terms of your functions. If you're only at the responsibility level and you're working to achieve a task, you're a spectator in this whole process. And you have to look at yourself and say, what can I do to move up to a point of delegating responsibility? And if not delegating, let's not take it literal, but if not delegating responsibility, to at least influencing the delegation, to at least influencing the direction as to where the execution level will occur. And then, of course, subject matter expertise. What knowledge do you bring to the table? Procurement has often talked, Tim, about sitting around the table and earning a right to be at the executive table. Well, to do that, you have to have a certain amount of expertise, right? You just don't want to come sit at the table and sip a cup of coffee. I mean, does that make sense, Tim?
It does.
Although, as we talked earlier, I wish I could sip a cup of coffee, but that's another discussion for another day.
It's the old what do you bring to the table.
That's right. What you bring and also update on progress and task completion. What is your ownership and accountability? So when you look at the position that you have now and your role, look beyond procurement, look beyond purchasing, look beyond sourcing, and look at this matrix and say to yourself, what level of involvement and influence do I have outside of a singular transactional task? And that is how you set yourself up to be in a position to have not only influence but impact as we move to more sophisticated procurement platforms. I mean, that's the best advice that I can give based upon what is emerging and what I see happening and will be happening over the next 12 to 18 months. So, Tim, would you take my advice?
It seems like sound advice to me. Okay.
Now, let's look at another thing, because now we've looked at the personalized side of things. And by the way, everyone, in the Q&A, I appreciate the feedback from Marie and Donna. Thank you so much for offering your opinion, as well as Najla. Feel free to comment on what I just said. Feel free to say, you know what, I don't agree with that, or I do. Or where are you in the progress? Again, the Q&A forum is open, live discussion. Only use first names, so no worry there. Anonymity, if necessary, is protected. But again, what are your thoughts on that, and where are you in the matrix? That's the key. Now, when we talk about an either-or scenario, we're talking about something called the standard or what's been a traditional debate in our world is centralization versus decentralization. So it's an interesting point. I know we've got another poll coming up, but what's interesting in terms of this thought is do you feel that any one of those is better? So before I put the next poll question up, I want to ask the audience, what is your feeling about this? Is a decentralized model or platform in terms of procurement practice, is that the best way to go, or is centralization the best way to go? Share your thoughts in the Q&A in terms of that, and as we move, give you a moment or two to think about that, let's move to our next poll question, which is the next side. Which procurement model does your organization use? Is it centralized? Is it decentralized? Is it hybrid? Not sure? Or no vote? I don't know why we have a no vote button there. Because if you don't vote, Tim, we wouldn't know about it anyway, right?
That's correct.
There you go. So centralized, decentralized, or hybrid. Now, when I use the term centralized and decentralized, Tim, what comes to your mind? See, you're going to be tested throughout this whole thing.
I think the graphic representation on the previous slide kind of represents that. We're centralized, all connected to a hub, decentralized, not necessarily so. And I would have to believe there's probably advantages to both scenarios.
Well, it's kind of an interesting thing, and I want you to remember that answer that you gave because, there's a certain element of logic there that we'll expand upon. Because far too often, this is an interesting point, is organizations become too black and white, too rigid in what their practice is at the expense of being able to respond to what could be considered the best need. You know what I mean? By that, Tim, it's like oftentimes you can become, a prisoner of functionality or structure without recognizing its benefit to your organization.
So why don't we go ahead and share the results, too, while we're doing this.
Okay. Let me just use this.
About 43% say centralized, 19% or 20% say decentralized, and just over a third say it's a hybrid.
Well, that's interesting. Okay, a third say it's hybrid. Let me just look at that a little bit. So I'm going to ask this question. Okay, now I've got a few comments on. Ryan said it depends on the category as to whether or not whether I prefer centralized or decentralized. Ryan, that's an interesting point. If you could, and we'll give you time, take a moment or two to maybe expand on that. That would be great. Kevin, you talked about pros and cons with each model. We recently became decentralized and are finding new benefits than when we were centralized, such as regional focus, stakeholder influence, and embedded support. So there's some interesting answers coming up here. Marjorie Nelson, and again, I'm sorry if there's any delays in my reading these because my thing's coming up a little bit slow. Maybe I'm reading slow. That's probably the caffeine withdrawal. Decentralized, Mayank said decentralized, the decision-making is independent. So that means that you provide greater power on the front lines. Now, I'm going to tie this back in for a moment. Going back to the previous question, and you see how this all connects together, the procurement, purchasing, sourcing, and going in that matrix that we talked about, all of these factors tie into this. Because if you go to a decentralized model, and I'm going to talk about this just very, very briefly before we move on beyond the results, and it seems to be well spread out, mostly centralized, a small percentage decentralized, hybrid. The question you have to ask yourself is, in the decentralized, so many are decentralized, is that because the model works more efficiently? Is that because there isn't that level of expertise to allow autonomous decision-making on the front lines? Like, why do you think some organizations are decentralized while others aren't? Or let's go the other way. Sorry, with decentralized, there is more confidence in being decentralized because you have that decision-making. But with a centralization where it's all under one central autonomous or a central body governing the procurement practice, I mean, is that a reflection of the fact that there's a lack of expertise at the regional level? Ryan says, I favor enabling the end users to conduct transactions. Kevin says, but the cons are now being decentralized. Well, let's see, what does Kevin say about the decentralized? things such as losing corporate-level best practices, loss of corporate vision and goals. So, what you're saying, Kevin, is that centralization protects the integrity and the continuity of the organizational practices, whereas if you decentralize, you have a potential risk that you will lose that control and that you'll get a disjointed series of functions and not necessarily adhering to what are the best practices and alignment with corporate vision and goals. I mean, is that what you're saying, Kevin? Please maybe expand on that. Depends on the dollar value, Autumn. When you say the dollar value, what does that mean, the dollar value? Are dollars influenced? And this is a point I pose out to everyone else. Are dollars influenced by whether or not you have a centralized or decentralized model? Are you suggesting, for example, Autumn, that with a centralized model, a vendor compression strategy brings in control of all suppliers so that you can maximize volume purchasing capabilities? Maybe if you could elaborate on that, that's very interesting. Najla says they work in a decentralized environment. Why decentralized? Why does that work for your organization where you don't think it won't? Sonia said they were decentralized, and they're coming in. The comments are coming in fast and furious, which is great. Sonia said we were decentralized 5 years ago, and it was centralized earlier this year. It became decentralized again. Now, Tim, when you're going from one way to another way to another way, it seems like you're dealing in extremes, right?
At first glance, yes.
Now, whether it's in procurement or not, what do you think some of the problems could be with that?
I would think reluctance from the staff.
It might create uncertainty as to what we're going to do next. Are we doing this from a strategic standpoint that is well thought out and executed? I'm often reminded when I see this, Sonia, by the way, of the old doom loop and flywheel concept of Collins's book, Good to Great, where he talked about organizations that will try different strategies, not necessarily gain traction with them, and then introduce another strategy and then go into this doom loop where others will introduce a strategy, turn around it and gradually introduce it, gain traction, gain successes, and then gain buy-in. I mean, you often think of these things in terms of the hierarchy. So very interesting. I mean, what does this? I mean, for me, it tells me that it's very much an open market. Now, and I'm going to throw another question into the mix here in terms of the question of centralization versus decentralization. Is that does it really matter at the end of the day when we're looking at a hybrid P2P? Does it really matter? And that's a question you have to ask yourself. There's some good points for centralization. There's some questions about decentralizations, create autonomous and empowerment at the regional level, which means that the front lines are more responsive to real needs as they're occurring versus being shackled by having what could be considered onerous terms and conditions that may not reflect how the real world operates. And this is a discussion and debate that has been going on for some time. Kevin Bessie, thank you. You said it best. End users can also get 3 quotes. And this is mainly because of manpower. You see, that's an interesting thing. Restrictions in manpower. Now, is that the number of people or is that the expertise of people in the organization? See, when we consider the question of centralization and decentralization, I'm going to move on to the next slide. When we consider that, we have to ask ourselves, why is that? And always reflecting back to what we talked about in the first section, is the expertise and the roles that we play within the organization actually does have an impact on the models that our organizations utilize. And ultimately, this reflects and ripples through to the technology that we leverage to get the best results. Now, going back to this 5 models for procurement organizations, and I think I said it before, Tim, but I'll be repetitive. The 5 models for procurement organizations article is something that's worthwhile to read. I know it's from 2011, but based on all my research, there is a logic that still persists with this, that it has not lost relevancy today, even though it's 6 years down the road. One of the things that's pointed out is what are the reasons why centralized procurement initiatives often promise substantial savings, then fail to deliver to the bottom line. Now, this goes back, and I'm going to refer back to the earlier comment. I'm sorry, I'll see if I can scroll up. I think it was Sonia who said, yes, Sonia who said, we were decentralized 5 years ago, and it was centralized earlier this year, and then became decentralized again. It'd be interesting to see, Sonia, if that return to a decentralized model was based upon this type of premise. that the delivery of the expected savings never materialized. If you could share that with us, that would be terrific. But ultimately, the centralized model doesn't and hasn't necessarily delivered the consistent results that organizations have expected. And it then goes back to the question, when you say, is it a manpower thing, which Autumn brought up? Is it expertise? All of those things are good. Now, while organizations tend to centralize here on sourcing and then decentralize to become more mature, in recent years we are now into what we call the centralization mode with the help of technology. Now, that's going to be an interesting term, with the help of technology, because we've always had technology, from the early days of the ERP-based procurement practices to the emergence of the cloud-based solutions, the on-demand solutions that are there that now take months, weeks, if not days to implement, versus the old days of 1, 2, 3 years in overarching big-budget initiatives. But in reality here, is it really mattering? When you look at the fact that if you move towards centralization, can technology make a difference? And that's one of the questions raised in the Spend Matters, and this is just from this past August in 2017, that there is a move back to centralization with help from technology. Now, bringing up the other, when you look at this, let's look at the type of models that are out there and what you're likely operating in. And share with me, if you can, in the chat room, which of these are reflective of the model that you currently have. Do you have a network model? Basically, do you have a coordinated activity across local units controlled by nodes or nodes in a network? Do you have a federal model, which is a direct combination of central and local models? Or do you have a completely centrally led network where all activity across local units are controlled by local nodes coordinated through a primary central node? In other words, is there a central brain that controls all of the purchasing? Which one of these are your models? Now, if you can describe them, share them with me here. But if not, these are things that you want to, again, look into and investigate more deeply in what you're doing, because this is what's emerging in terms of the framework of the models that are existing now, and those models that are moving forward to adapt to what's known as a hybrid P2P platform. So which are your areas? We're network, but Louis says we are network. But, and again, sorry for the delay in getting this to open up here. See, we could use Frank Sinatra during these brief delays, right, Tim?
That would be my choice.
Right. Now, we're networked, but slowly moving towards centrally led. So I've got to ask you this, Louis. Why is that the case? What's the reason for moving towards a centrally led from a networked environment? In your role within the organization, and I don't know what your position is, but do you have an understanding of why that happened, or is that just something that was thrust upon you with very little input? And remember, Tim, I talked about that CPO roundtable agenda, and the CPO executive who said, with one organization, I was actively involved in everything before any strategy or major procurement or acquisition took place. With my new organization, I'm giving more or less marching orders, and I'm basically reacting to direction rather than influencing direction. Within your organization, Louis, how much influence did you have on that decision? What do you believe led to that decision? And this is an important point, because as procurement professionals, if we're not involved intimately in the process from our day-to-day responsibilities and then having an understanding of the models of which we operate, not just knowing what those models are, but also understanding the role we play in bringing them to fruition or making a transition, for example, from a networked environment to a centrally led environment, we have to understand that. Why is that? Because unless we're in the position to do that, unless we're in a position to be able to tie these two elements together, moving to a hybrid P2P model will more or less be from a spectator role, which I don't think serves anybody's purposes, especially given the fact that procurement expertise and the insights and the knowledge and the strategic input that procurement professionals can provide can help an organization to choose the right path. And maybe part of the problem is, and going back to that earlier comment, when you look at it, and I'm not sure if it was Autumn or Sonia who said they went from one to the other to the other. I mean, you got to feel like a ping pong ball in those kind of situations. What can you do? And do you have that opportunity within your organization to influence the movement between a network to a federal to a centrally led network? That's really the key. That's really the key thing here. Now, one point I want to look up, and it just popped up for me, is Autumn said if it's under 10K, end users can order. How many of you thought when I talked about autonomy at the front lines, how many of you equated that with merely being able to make purchasing decisions without going through an approval hierarchy? Ask yourself that question. And then what I want you to do is expand your thinking in this regard of autonomy. It's not just a purchasing function based upon dollar amounts, but also a strategic function. How many of you on the front lines, when you talk about autonomy, are able to, for example, implement process improvements or submit process improvements and actually be heard within your organization? Remember, oftentimes there can be a disconnect between what's going on in the front line and what's going on at the executive suite. And, I remember one of the greatest laments, Tim, over the many, many years that I've been in this business, is that we know what's happening on the front lines, yet nobody's really listening to us, and it's a disjointed communication. And, instead of pointing fingers and saying, well, management doesn't listen, the reality is you've got to create the processes within an organization to communicate that effectively. And when you think of autonomy, and that starts with thinking of autonomy as being more than a minimum or maximum purchasing level, it thinks about having a strategic impact and influence on process that you can go and say, look, based on the front lines, based on the demands that we have from our clients that we're serving, both internal as well as external clients, based on that, we have to be able to suggest and recommend processes that we think would better the solution. And that's really the key there. So I want to encourage all of you, when you think about each of the things that you're hearing today, that you look at it from the perspective of not a functional or transactional standpoint, but you look at it as a strategic standpoint and your ability to influence the model itself. Because at this particular stage, where you are now, that's the starting point for going to the hybrid P2P. And this emergence of hybrid IT, hybrid P2P, all of these things and operating models provide an open door to take advantage of it, to be able to provide insights and contribute to the direction of your organization's practice. So I just want to say that. Tim, any thoughts to add to this, or am I going a little too fast?
No, I would agree with what you're saying on that.
Right. Now, Louis, and I want to add this because you're networked but slowly moving towards centrally led. I want to just open up and follow yours comment. I'm a buyer, but we have new upper management that is looking into a more strategic approach to procurement. The biggest challenge is that we have over 70 BUs, which each have their own processes. As a buyer, I've been asked for input so that upper management can make an informed decision. I mean, Louis, that's opening the door to you. Now, the question is, and as you attend this seminar, and as you check this resource material, participate in the tweet chat, the whole idea that you get from this is a better understanding of what options are out there so you can make that contribution. That's why I've provided the links to these articles in post, and there is, of course, other reference material, because we want to empower you. We're not just going to tell you, or I'm hopefully not just going to tell you in this session, well, this is what you need to do, and good luck to you. Hopefully we'll provide you with some of the building blocks to think and see things in a different way and be able to expand your knowledge on this area so that you can make that kind of a contribution. And kudos to your organization, Louis, because they are asking for your feedback, and we are dealing with what is known as a very, very complex world now, especially as we become more globalized, supply chains become more extended, and we deal with political elements. And we talked about this in the last webinar, Tim, about the Brexit impact on procurement overseas in the UK and Europe. And I mean, as supply chains begin to grow and become more complex, we're going to have more variables that we have to deal with. And that's why the session here hopefully will give you a foundation that you can go back to your organization and say, you know what, I understand the direction, I understand my role, what I have to do, again, with that matrix, where the various platforms or models are in terms of network, federal and centrally led. I understand that. And as I click through to the next slide, there's the music, a hybrid model. And this is from that same article. Finally, there's the possibility of a full hybrid. And somebody had said this earlier. I'm sorry, I don't remember because we've had a lot of comments today. But in large conglomerates, it may be sensible to run a networked approach in one division, a federal approach in another, and entirely local elsewhere, with varying lead responsibility at the center. Now, I love this comment, Tim, because what it recognizes is that there isn't a hard black and white solution that you have to go, and I'll go back to Sonia, where you went from decentralized to centralized to decentralized. Again, it's like that ping pong ball. what you should be doing and what Louis has talked about, and that's why I wanted to focus on your comment, Louis, and the impact, is that within an organization, especially larger enterprises, there has to be a large degree of flexibility to be able to look and say there is not a one-size-fits-all platform. So when we talk about a hybrid model, and this is where I mentioned at the top of the webinar, Tim, that when we talk about hybrid, we're not talking about technology, at least solely technology, and I'll get into that momentarily. When we talk about hybrid, we talk about a hybrid of not only your functionality and roles within your own organization, we're talking about a hybrid in terms of where to apply the best models for engagement and operation. Sometimes the network approach in one division will work, but if you try to apply it or blanket it all throughout the entire organization, it doesn't work. A federal approach in another will work. Local will work elsewhere. Now, there needs to be a varying degree of responsibility to the center, and that's where technology evolves into all of this. It creates the freedom to adapt to environments, different environments within an organization, without the sense of losing control. And I'll go back to that earlier comment, Tim, that somebody had made. Well, if you do have autonomy at the front lines, do you lose sight of the corporate policies? Do you lose sight of the corporate vision and all of these things? And that was maybe 5, 10 years ago at least. That was a viable problem because, let's face it, in terms of information, in terms of technology, we didn't have the intelligence at our fingertips that we do today. I can remember in the old days, back in the late 90s and early 2000s, when you wanted to generate a report through a traditional ERP-based solution. When you wanted to do that, by the time you got that information, it was already outdated. So you were basically dealing with information that was no longer applicable. Acquisitions were very slow through a finance-driven type of platform. Well, with today's P2P solutions like Zygus, information and intelligence are at your fingertips. One of the things I'm going to digress here, which I think is important, because one of the cycles that people talk about in that earlier discussion, we talk about procurement, purchasing, sourcing. What does that involve, and how does it? What functionality does it involve? And one of the things we talked about was supplier risk. Well, the key is as you expand and go into more suppliers, you go through more screening. When you have information that is available through IT technologies now, and again, I'll talk about the hybrid IT, but when you have that information at your fingertips in real time, and it's reliable, and it's accessible by everyone down the entire line, what that means is that you are providing those who are on the front lines with the insights and intelligence they need to make the best decision without having what you can call onerous oversight. What you do is you move from an oversight model to an insight model, and I'm going to talk about that. But and when I talk about the difference between oversight and insight, what comes to your mind, Tim?
Forgive me. Again, I was distracted handling some customer issues here, but so repeat the question again.
When you hear the term oversight and you hear the word insight, what comes to mind between those two?
Oversight seems more authoritarian and in control. Insight seems to be more intuitive and in touch with things. At least on the surface, it would appear that way.
Right now, and I want and that's very much true. And that raises the question: oversight or insight? Let me ask you out there in the audience: How many of you feel you have a structure that provides just oversight? How many of you feel you have a model that provides insight? And I'm sure you've all heard this differentiation in terms before. But there's a movement from an oversight model to an insight model. And, it may sound like an either-or scenario, but it actually isn't. But how many of you feel that you're in an oversight model where somewhat, as Tim, you used the word appropriately, authoritative, where there's a certain amount of dictation as to how you perform your tasks and how you do it and, dot your I's and cross your T's, versus empowerment through insight? Share those comments, and again, it's confidential. I'll only read your first name, but I'd be interested in seeing that because that raises the question. That creates the pathway to what I call a hybrid model. That creates a pathway to leverage technology most effectively. Now, I want to lead with this while you're pondering that question, and again, I encourage you to comment on that. I mean, do you even differentiate between oversight and insight, regardless of the model? Is oversight with insight possible? Remember I said it's not either or. So let's lead into this poll. We'll cue the Jeopardy music. That's what we need here, Tim, Jeopardy music.
What happened to Frank Sinatra?
Well, no, but it's true. Frank could be in the other areas where we have uncomfortable pauses. This is like one of those things, is the question, I should be answering. I should be posing the answer instead of the question, right?
That's correct.
Yeah.
For $200. Okay. All right.
For $200. Scrap the Jeopardy music. Let's go back to Frank. You can always count on Frank. So again, regardless of the model, is oversight with insight possible? 80.5% so far are saying yes. We'll give it a couple of, give it a few more minutes there just to see how that goes. I'll just...
It does seem to be pretty overwhelming here. So why don't we go ahead and close the poll, share the results. Over 82%, well, check that. About 81% say yes. Regardless of model, oversight with insight is possible. Only 5% say no, it is not possible, and about 13% say I'm not sure.
Okay, so I'm going to do this to encourage comment. When the ones who said that oversight without insight is not possible, and again 5%. And remember, there's no right or wrong answer here we're looking for, okay? We're looking for honest opinion and feedback. When you say it's not possible, why did you say it's not possible? So I'm going to pose that question out to those who said no. The ones who said yes, and there's an overwhelming response in favor of yes, why do you believe it is possible? And how is it demonstrated within your organization? That's really the key thing as well, because for those individuals who say no, it's not possible, or the 12.9% who say they're not sure, that may provide some additional insight for everyone else here participating in this webinar. I'm going to see what I have slide down. Not sure. We have an insight model. Okay, Ryan, I'm going to go here. Phil said the movement is slow. Phil, if you can expand on that as well. I mean, are you talking about me being slow in terms of talking and clicking, or are you talking about the movement in terms of from an oversight to an insight model? Clarify that. But we have an insight model. Ryan, why do you have an insight model? What is it that makes it an insight model? Nebula says not sure. Josie, everything is about culture. That's an interesting kind of a comment, Tim. Everything is about culture within an organization. So I presume, and correct me if I'm wrong, Jose or Jose, everything is about culture. When you say that, are you saying that the culture determines whether or not you have an authoritative or upper management that dictates how you operate and you're confined to that narrow scope of definition? Maybe you could expand on that a little bit more. Phil, you did. Thank you. Oversight with insight is a necessity. The movement from oversight to insight is slow. I'm opening that up. To happen. Okay, now that's an interesting point. So let me ask you this. We recognize that oversight with insight is possible, but the movement is slow to happen. Where does that originate? Is that originating, and we'll see, this is how it all ties back to the first section, Tim, is that it starts at the definition of what your role is and your involvement in the organization. You know, it's kind of funny, but inertia happens not at one point in an organization, but at multiple points. So, for example, if people in procurement are saying our role or purchasing is transactional and we have nothing else involved with the matrix, and again, everybody, please pay attention to that matrix because it provides a very good description of a collective need in terms of how procurement pros have to function. But is it because we have limited ourselves to a title functionality that literally has hemmed us into a silo of our job? Do we look at it and say, okay, no, we're just purchasing, we buy, and we conduct transactions? Do we get involved? Do we have the room and do we have the capability within our organization to get involved and expand our scope of focus so that we can become proactive in making a better model? And this leads into the next section that I talked about, which again, are we in a network environment? What environment do we have? And how do we transition into a hybrid model? And that goes back to the question or the comment to you, Phil, is that it all begins at multiple points. I believe, based on all the research that I've done, is the starting point is on the front lines, is on how procurement professionals define their role and what they are willing to do to step outside of the traditional boundaries that they believe existed or do exist. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes the restrictions that we place on what we do and how we contribute is really based on our own interpretation of what upper management is saying and doesn't necessarily reflect that. And we're very much in today's world, and make a note of this, is we're moving to a relational model or a relational environment, which again moves away from transactions and static points of requirements. So, Phil, that's what I would have to say with regards to that. Let me see if I can slide down here a bit more. We have a center of excellence. Ryan talks about a center of excellence that provides analytic dashboards for the lines of business to better understand their spend. And again, Ryan, I think that's an important part, and it does lead into functionality. The question is, Ryan, what do you do with that information once you have it? In other words, do you look at what the spend? Does it give you insights and go back and say, by the way, I know we have these insights and how they align with corporate objectives, but these insights also provide us with the ability to offer input that can help improve the process, can help us become a hybrid P2P practice. Phil, going back to you, talk about the leadership. It originates from leadership. I agree to a certain degree, and I can't comment on your particular area. Oh, you say, I see, not my job. Ouch. That's where a lot of the bottlenecks occur, is that I think we're entering an era, and it's not just in the procurement world. The IT, CFOs, CIOs, especially CIOs, are changing their whole approach. For many, many years, Tim, there have been articles and studies, one famous one of Harvard Business Review, saying, is the CIO becoming redundant in an organization? Should we change the title? In fact, CIO Magazine did a survey a number of years ago saying that we shouldn't call ourselves chief information officers because it's too confining, it's too limiting. I'd like to say this, that there's no such thing as not my job in this present world. There's so much influx, so much transition, so much dynamics in organizations, both internally and the demands being placed on by external clients, that you have to look at and say, we have to redefine our jobs and our functions overall. This is interesting. Now, let me see. It is, Joe, it's the way the organization is based. Hiring folks who are familiar, Sandra, and I'm glad. Thank you, Sandra, first time commenting. Hiring folks who are familiar with products and application gives insight. Oversight is necessary to guide. I couldn't have said that better. Tim, that sounds like Sandra may have hit it. What you do, that's right. The whole idea is that oversight and insight coexist, because what happens is oversight, if you think about senior management, they are the keepers of the company vision. They are the caretakers of that vision. That doesn't mean they own the vision. That doesn't mean they dictate how that vision is fulfilled. What it means is that they know the vision. Leadership's role, and this maybe goes back to what you said, Phil, about originates from leadership, leadership's role is to empower throughout the entire line of what that vision is, what the objectives are, and leave the opportunity for collaboration and communication to achieve that. There is more than one path, and while all roads lead to Rome, there are many roads and different ways to get there. And if you don't leave yourself open as an organization to do that, then that can be a problem. So going back there, your upper level management has to have that mindset, and you have to look at your organization to see if a hybrid P2P model, a hybrid procurement model, is actually feasible on this. But Sandra, I think you nailed it very much so. Oversight is necessary to guide. Insights provide you with the ability to execute, and I think that's the key. Ryan, you added on to this that the spend information gained has been useful in understanding the extent of tail spend, and also provides insights for other LBs to tap into existing suppliers whom they've previously not engaged. I agree with you on that. I think that's a great way where technology comes in, but I just ask you, Ryan, to stretch your vision a little bit beyond the transactional elements of that and start thinking of what that means from a strategic standpoint. And I mean, Tim, that's the whole key, I guess, of what we want to talk about when we talk about a hybrid P2P model, is that we want to be able to look at it and stretch beyond previously defined job functions. Now, I might be having a little bit of a problem here with the click because I just clicked another slide to come up, and I have no movement. Oh, there. Well, I jumped to the Q&A. I want to go back there.
Okay.
There was one slide. Hey, I'm excited. I'm doing pretty good on this. I just learned how to program my VCR last week.
It's no longer flashing 12 midnight?
That's right. Well, I took the brave step last year of moving from beta to VCR, so VHS. So. Now, Remember that earlier slide, a good model. While organizations tend to centralize sourcing, they can do it with help from technology. Notice how I wiped out everything else and said with help from technology. Now, I want to pose this out to the audience listening. When you talk about with help from technology, how has technology helped you? And I know, Ryan, you've sort of answered that with the information gained is useful, and Sandra, you've touched on that as well. But what role do you see technology playing going forward to be able to create a hybrid practice that encompasses all of these different elements within the same entity? In other words, I think we can all agree, well, maybe not, but I'll assume it is, and Phil, you're right, Sandra said it very well. I think we can assume that we all agree that a one-size-fits-all does not work in our world. Now, if you don't agree, tell me. And by the way, we're not looking for consensus here, Tim. I don't look for agreement. I look for discussion, because it's through disagreement and discussion that we gain a better understanding collectively of the subject matter. But if we look at it, how is technology helping, or how will it help to be able to move into this hybrid world? See, we should cue the music again, the Jeopardy.
There we go.
So, yeah, share those thoughts with us as well. Now, I'm going to add something in terms of this. When we go into it, and we'll have a brief final Q&A. And excuse me, I have a sneeze or two coming on, I think. See, that's probably a withdrawal from coffee as well, Tim, isn't it? I think that's a medical
I'm sure it is, yes.
But now, when we look at this, when I think about technology, and I alluded to it a little bit earlier in the discussion, when I think about technology, I'm going back to the years when I broke into the industry, and in fact, the high-tech world, where I looked at it, and I saw, before CPM, before DOS there was CPM, the punch cards. I've seen the evolution of all these things happening. And one of the things that I noticed with the ERP platforms versus the emerging P2P platforms and cloud-based solutions is that they're intuitively implemented. In other words, there isn't this requirement for organizations and people in procurement to change the way they operate so that they can fit within the function of the technology. Organizations like Zycus, for example, have created P2P technology that is intuitive and can adapt to the environment and empower you to get all kinds of real-time information in real time. In other words, there's no longer the delay of information. There's no longer an elongated implementation process before you start realizing some of the benefits. There's no longer a requirement. This goes back to the about a year and a half, 2 years ago, when a number of studies came out and saying the number one question procurement people used to ask themselves is, why can't I have a procurement platform or a process at the office that I have at home where it's much easier when I buy personally? We've now moved to a technological age where speed, accessibility, and intelligence is at our fingertips. So when I talk about leveraging this technology, we're talking about now looking beyond, and that's maybe what I wanted to do here, is stretch beyond the transactional element of, well, we got cost and spend, which I'm not saying isn't important, but think of what the technology can provide in the way of strategic capabilities. That is, in essence, the hybrid model. That is the ability to go ahead and say, we're not just dealing with the transactional element, we're dealing with a strategic element where there's influence, where we can take the caretakers in leadership who have the vision, who will share that vision with us, and we can add to, productively add to ideas and ways to achieve that in a shorter time frame and maintain our compatibility over the long haul. That's the whole idea of technology, and that's why technology is important. You can call it a linchpin, but what it does is it makes all of this possible, and I think that's the key. So that's what I have to say. Now, wait a second. I have, let me just look here, Marjorie, and I want to get to Marjorie because I don't think we've had a comment from Marjorie before. Technology, let me just bring that up, has automated the purchasing practices from sourcing, bidding, procuring, and this keeps maverick purchasing under control. Marjorie, I wouldn't argue with that. But again, what I just said, think of what that means strategically. Don't think of it as being an end result and, okay, I'm in line with what the goals and objectives are, whether under a centrally led model or whether under any kind of other model. Understand what that means to your organization. Understand what that means to your clients, both internally and externally. And this way, you can contribute something very, very important to the overall development and evolution of how your organization procures services and goods and does so on a strategic basis and achieves best value. Now, I just want to look at a couple more comments and see if there's any other questions. Tim, I think we're down to the last minute here, aren't we?
Indeed we are. That clock is relentless.
Okay. Well, one final thing I'll read here, and I want to give this to Phil. Let's see if I can get that up there. Technology can help if the organization spends resources on training and developing critical thinkers. You know what? I think that's a good place to start, developing critical thinkers. I'll only add to that, Phil, is that there has to be a willingness to want to develop into a critical thinker. And that goes back to the very first section that I talked about. How do you define your role? Do you see how it all ties in there, Tim? How you define your role evolves in terms of your influence and involvement with the procurement model, and ultimately how you leverage hybrid P2P technology to achieve the outcomes. That's how it all ties in. Do you see that?
I do, and perhaps it refers back, you referenced Good to Great, the old book by Collins, getting the right people on the bus, making it work.
Right. Absolutely. Listen, so I'm going to turn over the mantles back to you. I could talk for another hour, everybody. We'll have a tweet chat, obviously, here. Edith, you asked, how does a hybrid model fit in a healthcare vertical where government regulation is high and healthcare continues? I can't tell you that in about a minute, but certainly feel free to post that question on the P2P hybrid tweet chat. And you can reach out to me as well, and I can spend a little bit more time with you on specific fits of the model in specific industries and areas. And Tim, that's it for my time. Thank you.
And thank you, John. As always, a very informative and entertaining presentation. And again, the conversation continues at hashtag P2P Hybrid, the tweet chat going on. On behalf of the Institute of Supply Management and Zycus, I want to thank everybody for their participation in today's event. That concludes our program. Thanks again for joining us, and have a great day.